Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning to participants, colleagues, former colleagues, His Excellency Sim Sokeng, Secretary of State of the Ministry of Commerce, Andreas Jobrug, Deputy Ambassador of the Australian Embassy here in Phnom Penh. My name is Sven, and I am going to lead you through the session 1 and a little bit further into session 2 after the coffee break. For this first session, we wanted to, as Jeremy said, unpack the RCEP e-commerce agreement. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that is we have run a number of polls and surveys on LinkedIn, on Facebook prior to this workshop, just to sound out the interest of government officials and private sector on RCEP. And what we realized actually was that very little was known about the RCEP agreements, let alone on the different chapters, and especially from the private sector perspective. So we realized that instead of having a one single event on RCEP agreement, what it means for Cambodia, we would have a series of events of actually 5 episodes on specific chapter of the e-commerce of the RCEP agreement that were kind of prioritized by our stakeholders. So in this first session, what we would like to do is we want to level the playing field and explain what is the RCEP, what is the RCEP e-commerce agreement, how it works for government, how it works for the private sector, and how it works also in Cambodia, meaning is Cambodia ready to avail of the opportunities from the RCEP e-commerce provisions. To do this, I have 3 panelists joining me in the session 1, and very happy to have them here. And thank you for accepting to be in our first panel and to be in this episode. And hopefully, because of your wealth of knowledge in other parts of the agreement, we hope to have you in next episodes. So joining me in this first session is Dr. Sok Sipana. Dr. Sok Sipana is a practicing attorney and the founding partner of Sok Sipana & Associates, a very established law firm here in Phnom Penh. He was appointed by the Prime Minister Samdech Techo Hun Sen to hold concurrently the position of advisor of the royal government of Cambodia, as well as advisor to the Supreme National Economic Council, SNEC in short, and as advisor to the CDC, which is the Council for the Development of Cambodia, with the rank of minister in August 2009 and November 2011, respectively. He was reappointed as a senior advisor to the royal government of Cambodia in September 2018 with the rank of senior minister, and in the lead to Cambodia hosting the 13th ASEM Summit, which is next month. He's also entrusted with the responsibility of ASEM SOM, or SOM in short. Prior to this, and this is where we actually met, Dr. Sok Sipana was Secretary of State at the Ministry of Commerce from 1999 to 2005. And from October 2005 to July 2009, he had a short stint in the international community as director of the International Trade Center in Geneva, which is a technical agency of the UNCTAD and the WTO. But after a short time, he decided that he was much more needed and useful here in Cambodia, so he returned to Cambodia. Thank you, Dr. Sok Sipana, for joining us today. I also have the pleasure of having my good friend, Dr. Deborah Enns, who is the founder and executive director of the Asean, ASIAN, not ASEAN, Asian Trade Center. The Asian Trade Center, or ATC in short, works for governments and companies to design better trade policy for the region. Dr. Enns is the president of the Asia Business Trade Coalition, ABTA in short. She served on the Trade and Investment Council of the World Economic Forum from 2017 to 2019, on the International Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professional Alliance, GTPA, and was the chair of the Working Group on Trade Policy and Law. She was also a senior fellow in the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry Trade Academy. Dr. Helms received a PhD in political science from the University of Washington and a lot of other diploma. And she's also publishing a very useful, for the trade nerds that we are, a useful blog, which is called Talking Trade Blog. Thank you, Deborah, for joining us from Singapore as well. Finally, we have Ms. Niria Sereng, who is the Deputy of Banking, Finance and Technology Practice Group at the FDL office in Cambodia. She has 11 years of experience in the legal practice. She graduated with a bachelor degree in both law and psychology. She is very well recognized in Cambodia as an expert in e-commerce, but more importantly on e-commerce law. And throughout her career, she mainly advises international, national banks, capital market intermediaries, insurance companies, fintech, etc., on compliance, on regulatory matters. She has experience in financial technology as well, fintech, including payment, gateway, e-wallet, digitalization, and tokenizations, a word that we're going to hear a lot in the future, tokenization, cloud computing, satellite, and so forth. Thank you, Nirat, for joining us today. And I have divided this session in actually three parts, three questions. So His Excellency Soxipana will try to unpack, really, it's the word, the e-commerce provisions of the RCEP, the famous Chapter 12. What it is, how it works, is it a bit shallow, as we've heard? How can governments promote the adoption of the provisions? As I think we mentioned earlier, there is a work plan for the implementation of the provisions in Cambodia. So how can we make sure that whatever is in the work plan is actually being implemented? Then I will ask Deborah to go and explain what's the benefit for the private sector of the RCEP agreements, and also obviously of the e-commerce provisions. And finally, I will go back to Nirat and ask Nirat, what does it mean for Cambodia? Are we ready? Do we have the laws and regulations that must be in place for us to really avail of the opportunities presented by the RCEP agreements? I have given roughly 10 to 12 minutes to each of our speakers to present their ideas, their suggestions, their recommendations. But I would like also to encourage our audience today to use the chat box to ask any questions you want. Please tell us to who you want to ask the question, and then ask your question in the chat box. And our colleagues in ERIA will make sure that we filter, and I will relay the question back to you. With this, again, thank you for joining. Dr. Soxipana, over to you. What is RCEP? What is the RCEP e-commerce provisions? How do they work? Are they obsolete already? Are they still very valid? How can we understand? How shall we understand those provisions? Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Sven. Honestly, I think it is quite a shallow chapter, to be very frank, because a lot of this provision are very, it's sort of like standard, but you have to bear in mind that in the context of Cambodia, it's quite suitable, because most of the Cambodian entrepreneur, they still, I would say, they still quite young in this context, and the provision the RCEP it's sort of like enable the basic trading aspect in e-commerce. Like, for example, if you want to do business, you have to recognize the sort of like the electronic aspect of the signature, for example. This is something quite new, because let's face it, in our civil code, it doesn't say anything about the electronic thing, because it was passed way back in 2007, the civil code, right? So the notion of electronic signature is not there yet. So introducing this legal aspect of the contract, in a digital world, sort of like it's unravel a new dimension of doing business in Cambodia. But these are some of the specificity that I think does give the RCEP some weight into doing business in Cambodia. Consumer protection, again, it's quite young. I mean, in the case of Cambodia, many things are young. You know, we just had the competition law coming out just about last month, right? So all this new thing will sort of like go at the same time. You know, the RCEP on one side, the domestic law on one side. But it will takes time. It will take like wine. You know, you bottle 5 years ago is still undrinkable, but it's all right. You can drink a vin de table. But I think, you know, it will takes time before all this notion will sort of settle in, and then it give the opportunity for the Cambodian e-commerce doer to sort of appreciate why it's important to recognize the signature, digital signature, something like that, right? Competition, it's clear, but I would say as a law that is quite young, and knowing the context of Cambodia, it will take a while before it's settled down, before they can get the mechanism to implement in place, that sort of thing. See, so but all in all, I think the RCEP does give the minimum operating standard, you know, for Cambodian to enter the sphere of e-commerce, right? So what else is important? I think the protection of personal information is important, because here, you know, the RCEP does sort of like provide a framework, you know, to protect personal information for user e-commerce, but it does not really say in detail. But what it is just that it required that the Cambodia take into account international standard, principle, guideline, criteria that are used in international organization or international body. But it does set the stage, right? For example, for the spam, we call the spam, but it's the technical word is the unsolicited commercial electronic message. It allow, you know, the country to regulate that, so that if you don't want the spam, this unsolicited email to come, you have the possibility to do some to opt out, for example, something like that, right? But for the main thing is that for the domestic regulatory framework, in this case, the e-commerce law, the RCEP sort of like it asks that the country take into account, or at least be consistent with the UNCITRAL model law of electronic commerce, the United Nations Convention on the use of electronic communication in international contract. But again, Cambodian law is already in compliance. You know, I was involved way back about 10 years ago in the drafting of the Cambodian e-commerce law, and it was at that time it was already in compliance. So in that sense, we are already meeting the requirement of the you know, the RCEP there. Duty, custom duty, of course, we right now we are still, you know, we are not taxing, but we have and I think the other speaker will speak about the e-commerce taxation, because I think the Department of Taxation is introducing a VAT or something like this. Again, you know, we are not supposed to you know, tax the custom duties on electronic transaction, but the law does allow us to introduce regulation, as long as non-discriminatory, as long as applied across the board, you know, with Cambodian, with international, as long as applied across the board, you know, we can introduce you know, this regulation. And the thing about this RCEP is that you know, a lot of things they keep referring to the legitimate public policy space, right? So it does give the possibility for the Cambodian government, if it find that it want to push a certain legitimate public policy, to introduce some, I would say, inconsistent measure in the law. So I think in the case of Cambodia, we do have quite a bit of space, you know. I'm not so sure how much space we will use to sort of like move into inconsistent measure. But knowing Cambodia for the last nearly 30 years, Cambodia is quite an open society. It's quite and Sven and I, we go back to the WTO days. Cambodia is quite a open and liberal economy, and I think the ASEP, it's a sort of like a mini WTO for Cambodia anyway, because the effect of WTO is sort of die off. And to me, I think the ASEP is a sort of like a second generation of reform that will push the Cambodian government to introduce a lot of other measures to stir up investment to Cambodia. And for that matter, we recently have the new law on investment, which sort of like the list of a sector that that the government is introducing to incentivize the investor to come to Cambodia. It reflects that. It reflects the entry to force of ASEP. It reflects the new trend of the sector, that the government hope to attract to Cambodia. But all in all, I think ASEP will give that extra boost for the economy to go for the second wave of reform, so that we can compete with the rest of the world. And for sure, e-commerce will set the pace for our entrepreneur to move into the space. As you can see, the thriving entrepreneurial community in Cambodia is exciting, and you have and so Keng have mentioned also other policy measure that the Cambodian government is introducing. But all in all, I think ASEP will open up a new wave of opportunity for the Cambodian for the next 10 years. I hope so, yeah. So Sven, that's all I have for now, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sipana. Thank you very much. I like the analogy with the WTO, because back in the days, you had to take your shepherd stick and go out to the provinces, to the different constituents to explain what the agreement was all about, the different aspects. We actually were inspired by that, because this is what we are trying to do with this RCEP dialogue, to make sure that we no longer go under the mango tree as we used to do, but we use the digital means nowadays, because we have to use them because of the pandemic. But yes, indeed, and this is also to say that countries like Cambodia are also involved in negotiations at the WTO on the GSI on e-commerce, which I think are going much beyond what is in the agreement, using the best practices around the world, from the DIPA in this region to other regions. So indeed, I think you confirm some of what we have heard so far, the shallowness of the agreement, but the fit for purpose that we have here in Cambodia. So thank you, Dr. Sipana. I think there will be questions, follow-up questions, so please don't leave us too soon. And I now turn to Deborah. Deborah, you've been really much involved in the RCEP negotiations. You've written a lot about the RCEP negotiation, including on e-commerce and what they mean for the private sector. And some of your writings, you basically concur with what Dr. Sipana was saying on the shallowness of the agreement, especially vis-a-vis other agreements on the digital space being negotiated. We wanted to have your views on how do you feel the private sector would benefit from the RCEP agreement, but more importantly from the e-commerce agreement, based on what you have seen. And we understand that the situation might be very different in Singapore or in Malaysia as it could be in Cambodia or Laos. So what's your take on this? Is the private sector that is listening to us today, and we'll have a session with the private sector just after this one, is going to can benefit from this agreement or not? Over to you, Deborah.
Excellent, thank you very much. So the short answer to that is yes, you can benefit. Can you benefit from the digital provisions of RCEP? From a business perspective, this is the weakest part of an agreement that otherwise I think has some really interesting and innovative parts in it. So I put together a quick slideshow that I'm gonna show, because I just think I have a lot of details and I know not everyone is a native English speaker, so let me just make this easier for everyone. You can see my slides, yes? It's coming up full screen. There we go. You can see them? Fantastic.
Yes,
Okay,
go ahead.
so let me go through this. And again, we've been working on RCEP. I mean, I personally went to a lot of rounds. I'm delighted to see Pak Yaman, who drove this agreement from start to finish. You know, all hail to him and his incredible stamina for doing so. That was 8 years of work and a huge number of rounds and negotiations and complexity. And now we are about to start. So in January, we will have RCEP in place. We already have 6 of the ASEAN members, and at any moment now, Australia and or New Zealand will put in the final letter, and then we will actually start. So assume January 1st, 2nd, somewhere right around the very beginning of January, it will start. But do note for businesses, it will not start in all 15 markets. So at the moment, we have not got Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia in particular, Myanmar, and the Koreans, I don't know where the Koreans are. So we will have it start, but not with everybody. Cambodia, I'm delighted to say, as has been mentioned before, one of the very first in ASEAN to focus on RCEP, to get it ratified and to begin the implementation process. And I think, having worked with an awful lot of RCEP members, Cambodia is actually the farthest already towards implementation, but also capacity building like this one, to make sure that the business community understands what's in this agreement and why it matters. And without that, it's a pointless agreement, because lots of government officials can spend all day talking about these kinds of issues. But if business doesn't get it, if they can't use the agreement, then it frankly is pointless. So let me talk about, sadly for me, the least impressive part of the agreement, which is the e-commerce chapter. This should have been the most exciting part of the agreement. And it's why I spent so much time going to RCEP, because I said, Asia, way ahead in digital. Way ahead in digital. Even places like Cambodia have such interesting and innovative firms who are delivering services and providing goods in the e-commerce space that I think is fascinating and should have been very, very far ahead. We have tons of work at the ASEAN level. The ASEAN e-commerce agreement is being implemented, hallelujah. I know that my company and Sven's company spent a lot of time developing the work plan for the e-commerce agreement in ASEAN, now underway, fantastic. Lots of new digital only agreements, great. Lots of digital rules and lots of free trade agreements, fantastic. Almost none of that appears in RCEP. So unfortunately, while we have lots of interesting digital innovation, experiences, agreements that include digital, it's not RCEP. And the problem is that this agreement, RCEP itself, has lots of benefits, and we really will need to push hard to make sure that we increase or improve the digital parts of RCEP over time. It's unfortunate, what can I say? So why do I say it's not the best? Because there are 3 things that businesses especially care about, and none of them really are useful in RCEP. The first one is you need information to flow, because you can't conduct your business if information gets blocked at borders. So you need to be able to access customers, suppliers, you need to find vendors, distributors, you need to find a lot of things. If that information gets blocked at the border or isn't guaranteed, that's a major problem for companies. The second thing you care about is where you host data. Most of you are cloud-based firms these days, right? You get whatever vendor you can to host your information, and you personally don't care where it is. As long as it's efficient, safe, fast, and affordable, you don't care whether your information necessarily sits in Cambodia or sits in Singapore or sits anywhere. The point is you need access to information. So you want a rule that allows that information to sit anywhere where you get the best services at the best price for you. So that's called data localization. And the third thing that you care about, even though you may not realize that you care about it, you're about to discover you care a lot about this point. Right now, we have a rule that's called a customs moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions. Now that sounds awful. It sounds like something you don't care about, but let me tell you what it does. It says if you're delivering digital services like education, graphic design, landscape architecture, you work with grocery market vendors to order products, you don't have to pay customs duties, which are tariffs, on those transmissions, on those cross-border delivery of services. what you want is to not have to pay customs tariffs. You don't want to paperwork, you don't want to pay them. That should have been anchored in RCEP and was not. Why not? Because at the end of the day, there were governments in RCEP who refused to participate in ambitious rules on these 3 areas. No surprise, most of those governments are not going to be there on the first day. So we have now got poor rules designed by people who aren't even at the table. So it's very frustrating. That I think is a missed opportunity, and businesses will have problems dealing with RCEP. Fortunately, in Cambodia and other parts of ASEAN, for example, you can also rely on the ASEAN agreements. So it's not the only way to solve some of these challenges, but it's not great. So with that sort of depressing beginning, let me tell you what you do get out of RCEP, which in the e-commerce space for trade in goods, extremely useful. For trade in services, there's a lot more benefits, and it should be easier to trade services of all different kinds. But let me talk about trade in goods specifically. Let me give you 2 examples, and I gave you the slide. You'll have the slides afterwards. You can go into these in more detail. The point of this is just to say, if you are doing e-commerce trade in goods, there are some benefits in RCEP, even for complicated topics like here I'm doing one for cookies, biscuits, chocolate chip cookies, just to show you what is happening in RCEP. This chocolate chip cookies, I will tell you, is a tough one because it contains chocolate and sugar and dairy, and these are all very sensitive items. But you can see that if you're trying to export these products around RCEP, the tariff rates that you face is very high. It ranges from 8 to 20% on cookies. That can make it impossible for Cambodian cookie biscuit companies to try to export products in this space because it's too expensive. But you can see that on the right-hand side, those tariffs are dropping. They're not dropping immediately, but they are dropping. And some of them drop quickly, some of them don't. The point is that this is true for almost every kind of product. So most products in RCEP will experience tariff cuts. Some of them will come fast, and some of them will matter a lot because they're in markets that are very lucrative and very lucrative for Cambodian companies looking for new opportunities. So there will be tariff cuts coming in biscuits and lots of other things. The second thing that matters a lot is the way in which you make these products. And I don't want to go into detail now. There's a subsequent event coming up on tariff cuts and rules of origin. But I just want to say that RCEP provides more flexibility around how we make products, including agricultural goods, that is very useful for firms based in Cambodia. So you can more easily make a biscuit or a cookie or whatever, and then send it to all of the participating members of RCEP. And so that is extremely helpful. And I would note, and the reason why I've put this here is that the rules can be different from what ASEAN uses. So if you are used to using ASEAN rules, you need to be a bit careful with RCEP, because there can be different rules. So in ASEAN, those of you who've ever had to deal with tariffs and rules of origin, you will know that ASEAN loves what it calls the regional value content. You add up all the stuff in a cookie, and as long as you hit 40% of the content from within ASEAN, it counts. RCEP doesn't always use the same rule. So I'm just warning firms now, please do read the directions or get advice on how to do this, so that you make sure that you are not falling afoul of the rules, that you are following the rules as they are written. Let me give you one more quick example, and then I'll be finished. For garments and textiles, there are some real benefits actually in RCEP. And given the dominance of this sector to the Cambodian economy, I think this is really important. So until now, we have had, I'm just going to talk about swimsuits for a moment. Swimsuits have had very high tariffs across most of the RCEP economies. Over time, those tariffs will cut to potentially 0, depends on the government. Some of those cuts look very long. So you can see here that this one, actually, it's cut off on the edge of my screen, but many of these cuts currently set for 15 years could be brought forward. So you may get accelerated benefits over time. But the point is they're coming down. I think that's very useful. And here you can see swimwear coming in across ASEAN. Many of the ASEAN tariffs on swimwear have been very high and are dropping relatively quickly. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have new benefits coming in textiles specifically and in apparel. I think that is really useful. And I just want to mention this one briefly, the rules of origin, the way that you make those products is very helpful for firms based in Cambodia, because as long as you had fabric, it was elastic, it was whatever one uses in a swimsuit, and now it's a swimsuit, it will qualify as an RCEP swimsuit and it will get those lower tariffs. So this is, I think, a very big deal, especially for firms trying to sell e-commerce goods, because it means that you are more likely to make a product that can be sold around RCEP through e-commerce channels and avoid having to pay tariffs, especially as your firm gets bigger and you're selling more volumes and you can no longer use the low thresholds for e-commerce goods. This matters a lot to you, even if you don't recognize it at the moment. Very useful, very important rules. And let me just show you the difference between RCEP's rules and some of these other agreements. Now, I know you're not in CPTPP at the moment in Cambodia, but the point is just to show you that the RCEP rules of origin was fabric, now it's a swimsuit, qualifies, is so much easier than some of these other agreements where you don't even have to understand what you're seeing. You just have to say, wow, that is looking very complicated. And so many of the other alternative agreements can be super complicated, and so complicated that firms actually can't meet the rules. RCEP tends to have simple, easy to use rules, which means that you will get the tariff reductions much, much easier. And that, I think, is a big benefit in RCEP for e-commerce sellers and sellers of any kind who are trying to move goods around Asia. So even though we don't have great digital rules, we do have very good trade rules, including, and this is the last slide that I have here, the paperwork requirements. So you will just need one preferential certificate of origin to send to all of the RCEP markets, instead of having to say, well, this one goes to ASEAN, I need ASEAN Form D. This one goes to Korea, I need a different form. This one goes to Australia, I need a different form. We will have one certificate of origin, and that will also help you do a better job of managing your trade, managing your compliance costs. And then there's some rules in there about moving goods faster. And all of that matters for e-commerce, because you know that time is money, especially for e-commerce. No one will wait for your ordered swimsuit to arrive for 3 weeks while we clear customs. So I think all of this is very helpful. And the last point that I just want to emphasize, for those of you who are slightly larger firms, RCEP has in it an authorized operator scheme, which will also facilitate movement of products across borders. If your firm qualifies, you should get into that scheme, because it will move your goods faster, clear your goods faster at borders. So in short, while the digital rules, the straight digital rules, are less exciting, I think, in RCEP, what is exciting are many of the other benefits that are contained in this agreement. And so when you combine what RCEP has with some of the digital rules elsewhere, like in ASEAN's own commitments, you end up with a much easier way to do trade and many more opportunities for businesses in Cambodia to find new markets in and around Asia for goods and services as well. And so I think this is really worth paying attention to, and I'm delighted to see so many people who are on this webinar and hopefully watching it after the fact. And so great job in getting it done. Delighted to have Cambodia in charge, especially of the implementation next year, because there are genuine benefits for firms coming from RCEP. So let me stop there. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. So not all hope is lost, but we have to do our homework, and businesses as well need to do their homework to understand what the benefits are from the RCEP provision, but also from, as you say, Deborah, from the ASEAN e-commerce agreement, which goes beyond some of what we have observed in the agreement. So Deborah, I think your presentation can also apply to other topics. And as you rightly said, we will have a number of other dialogues on rule of origin, on trade facilitation, on services, and on investments at the rhythm of once a month. So I hope you will also be joining us again for the next episode. Thank you, Deborah. With all what we have heard from Dr. Sipana and from Dr. Ernst, now I'm coming back to Cambodia. I'm coming back to our businesses, our MSMEs in Cambodia. We have heard from Excellency Sim Sokeng all the achievements that we've had in Cambodia, from the e-commerce law, the e-commerce strategy, from the implementation decree on licenses for e-commerce businesses or operating on e-commerce. We also have the introduction of the VAT for digital foreign digital providers. We've had a lot of progress and achievements that have been highlighted by Dr. Sipana and Deborah, but Niraj, from your perspective and from what you hear from your customary clients that you advise, and from what you've been doing in supporting the e-commerce law in the past 2 years, is Cambodia fit for purpose? Are we ready? What type of support businesses need to really use the tools that have been developed to be compliant with all these tools? I understand that, for instance, businesses can register as e-commerce businesses, but not a lot of SMEs have been doing that so far. So tell us what you've observed in the past months and years on e-commerce. Over to you.
Thank you, Sven. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Sipana and also Dr. Deborah for giving a brief on the RCEP and e-commerce as well. So without further ado, my name is Niriro. I am the Deputy Head of Technology, Banking and Finance Practice Group here at DFDL in Cambodia. Also, with the support of ADB, I was the national consultant to support the MOC and all the stakeholders to draft the e-commerce regulation in Cambodia. So, as you already know that under 20 chapter under the RCEP, one of the chapter is focusing on the e-commerce, and that chapter, as Deborah said, is actually a bit vague, and I could understand that because many developing countries are still like, I mean, the legal system is still in the progress and will take a long time to adopt or to align with it. And for example, like His Excellency Secretary as mentioned, for e-commerce regulation or e-commerce law, we take us for 10 years to actually finally adopt it in 2019, and that's why it take a long time. So overall, I think the existing legal landscape under the e-commerce actually align with the RCEP, especially on the e-commerce itself. So maybe I could present my slide, please. Okay, for this presentation, I would like to have two key topics. The first one, whether our existing e-commerce regulation aligns with the RCEP, and the second, what are the overview of the e-commerce regulation itself. And then I also have a mini agenda. The first one is the overview of the e-commerce regulation in Cambodia, and then the second is the key compliance with the e-commerce regulation. And third is what happens if you don't apply, the sanction, and fourth is the key actions. Next, please. Next, please. Further. Okay. So the question would be, what is e-commerce in Cambodia? So any commercial transaction that conduct via the electronic system are considered as e-commerce. And also the question would be like, what are the applicable regulations? And actually the e-commerce itself and also the traditional commerce are actually not too different, except like all the commercial transactions that conduct via platform or internet or on app are considered as e-commerce. So the regulation applicable, the applicable regulation are not too different. And of course, the first three are e-commerce regulation itself, which I will talk further detail the next slide. And of course, as actually Sokeng mentioned that fintech or payment gateway will be also one of the key important for the e-commerce as well. And then of course is digital signature, and the draft law on cybercrime is still in draft law. And my bad is actually the law on competition law actually has recently adopted. And then of course the law on consumer protection. Next, please. So as I mentioned that the e-commerce regulation actually any commercial that are conducted on the internet as considered as e-commerce. However, there are some exceptions, including a POA or anything, attachment or other method related to succession and also immovable property. And these are the exceptional that not applicable to the under the e-commerce law. Next. And so and so who will be governed by this e-commerce law? They are under the law itself. They categorize two types, and the first one is e-commerce service provider, and the other one is an intermediary. So who are those two? And so for anyone or any person that provides the service or goods through internet, it's considered from the B2C, like business to and a customer or end user, are considered as an e-commerce service provider. And for those who are actually the person that initiate or support between the business provider and end user are considered as an intermediary. Next, please. And so those intermediary could be internet service provider, telecom service provider, or search engine, etc. These are the intermediary under the e-commerce law. And then the second agenda would be what are the key compliance under the e-commerce regulation that you need to know as well. And of course, the first one is the license and the permit. That's the mandatory requirement. And in order to get the license or permit, you need, first of all, you need to obtain an online service certificate from the MPTCs. And once you get that, then you can further to obtain a license or permit from the MOC in order to provide the e-commerce service in Cambodia. And next, please. And so I think the difference between the traditional business and the e-commerce is that if you want to buy something, you're going to go to shop and you're going to taste or look at it and etc. Right? But from the business, online are different. So you need to have certain information in order to make decisions, etc. So under this clause, Article 29 under the e-commerce law, these are the information that for the business need to have. First of all, of course, if you are a company, then you need to have a name and then trademark name, and then you all need to provide also legal name as well. And then you need to provide your actual address and also electronic mean of contact, could be fax, email, telephone, etc. And make sure that your communication are easy and effective. And you also need to provide the actual information of the good or service that you need to be offered, like the actual size or actual color or actual etc. And then last but not least is the term and condition that you need to have as well. And those term conditions must include all the costs that associate with your service or your product. And second is the method of payment, like whether you accept cash on delivery or you need accept a credit card, etc. And then third is cancellation, whether you allow the customer to cancel or terminate, and if you terminate or cancel, whether you allow them to exchange or return the product or services, and so forth. And next, please. So the idea or the purpose of this minimum information just to make sure that it's provide enough sufficient information to allow the customer in order to make a decision. But however, this specific clause is actually not applicable to security and exchange sector and also insurance, because this industry actually have a separate and different type of information they need to have. Next, please. And another key compliance that's also important is the consumer protection. And so for those people that hold information in electronic, and make sure that this information will be protected within the reasonable manner. However, the law fell or doesn't mention what are the reasonable manner to protect those kind of information. And then further in the second clause of the article also mentioned that person shall not interfere, like your access or retrieve or copy or extract, etc. And this actually under the consumer protection law actually also complying with the RCEP as well. And because RCEP also requires the member to have the regulation that protect the consumer protection as well. Thank you. And then another requirement is that is the unsolicited communication. If you plan to have a mass marketing on internet or on electronic platform, you need to allow customer or consumer to have an option to reject future unsolicited communication. And this actually also aligns with RCEP as well, that member need to have a regulation or clause saying this unsolicited communication. Next, please. And I think the third agenda, probably something you not want to hear, but also important to know, is the sanction. Like what happens if you don't comply with the existing regulation under the e-commerce law. So the in charge ministry, which is the Ministry of Commerce of Cambodia, what happens if you're not complying and what will they take action? First of all, probably they're gonna write a written warning. And then if you're still not complying with their warning, and then probably they're gonna cease your business activity or the business transaction itself. And then further, they're probably gonna suspend your business. And then if you already have the license or permit, probably they're gonna revoke it. And further, you still not comply, then there's some certain penalty, including jail time and also money. And 4 is the key actions. Like what are the key actions you need to consider? Next, please. So the key action is that when you go back, probably you want to comply with all this existing regulation. And first of all, you probably need to apply for all the mandatory license and permits. And then you probably also would like to review existing policy and also your term and condition as well, whether they are complying with the minimum information under the e-commerce law. And then the 4th is the content and website itself, whether are applicable. And the 4th is whether you're for your e-brochure, your e-marketing, whether you have an option for the unsolicited communication where you allow the customer not to receive it in the future. So I think that's the end of the presentation itself. So overall, from my what I understand is that actually the existing e-commerce regulation landscape actually broadly aligned with the RCEP, and mostly, and I think because e-commerce regulation itself only adopted in 2019, and then the government His Excellency Sven mentioned that the government only ratified and also promulgated this RCEP like this year. So actually the law happened first, and then this RCEP only happened later on. And what I understand is that the data protection regulation is not really strong in Cambodia yet, and I think it's also one of the most important elements for a country that need to protect their own citizens regarding how this giant business handle all their personal information. So I hope that the future that the government will have a separate that strong data protection in order to protect all the how to handle the personal information of the individual and so on. So I think this is the end of my presentation. And if you have any question, you can ask. Thank you. The floor to you, Sven.
Yes, thank you, Nirat. This was very helpful. And maybe we still have like 10 minutes for question and answer. Maybe a question to you directly, Nirat, without revealing any corporate information. But as we've heard, RCEP is about 15 member states. And as one of the key law firms in Cambodia, do you get requests for information, inquiries on how to invest in Cambodia on e-commerce from other companies situated in the RCEP member states?
Thank you, Sven. Actually, of course, we have a lot of query regarding how to comply with these new regulations. And one of the main, I think, challenge is the requirement of the license itself and a permit. That because if because under the sub-degree of the e-commerce law itself, that any person that have provide services within Cambodia and outside Cambodia need to get the license and a permit itself. But because these business are offering from offshore, not inside Cambodia. So it's impossible for them to get the license or permit within the Ministry of Commerce. So it's not convenient for them just to provide like a small market and need to set up the whole country. I mean set up a company and also get the license and all the licenses. I think that's one of the challenges that I observe. And then there's a separate regulation on the VAT on the e-commerce service provider as well, which is not really aligned with the law. And I believe that some regulations are conflict with each other. I think that's a challenge for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirad. On this very item, I know that Dr. Deborah has very strong views. Is it something, Deborah, that we've seen in other market, in other member states, this introduction of VAT on e-commerce, especially for what we call non-residents? And we've heard from Nirad that maybe in some cases for SMEs, it's not really worth the cost of trying to comply with the new regulation. So this is the trend among ASEAN members and RCEP to have this digital taxation on VAT, for instance?
I think it's a great question, and it's something that I would suggest Cambodian e-commerce sellers especially need to pay attention to, and e-commerce buyers who are trying to buy from overseas. What we have had in place, to make this very simple, is we have had like a threshold. And if you're below that threshold, then you don't need to pay taxes and you don't need to fill out customs paperwork. So for small businesses, this has really facilitated cross-border e-commerce trade. But there are at least two challenges coming for this model that has been working pretty well at allowing small businesses to find new markets overseas. The first is that the thresholds vary. In fact, there's a question that's just come in on the Q&A function. The thresholds vary from as high as $800 US to $0. So Australia just went to $0, which is a disaster. It means that every single product, even if you're selling, one pen or one tea bag into Australia, you now have to pay potentially taxes plus customs paperwork and potentially duties. That is a nightmare for small businesses, right? If it's zero. And inconsistent thresholds is also a nightmare for small businesses, because how do you know what the threshold is in any given market? You have to do a lot of work. There's a lot of research. It's a pain. So we have threshold issues and changing thresholds and inconsistent thresholds. And then there's a second category of problems, which we can see in Cambodia and elsewhere, the imposition of VAT on e-commerce goods, but increasingly also digitally delivered services. This is a new one. Both of those, I think, are a real problem for small businesses because for so many reasons. So like with the thresholds for just general e-commerce goods, the threshold, the value of the VAT varies tremendously, from small values of VAT to 25% VAT in some markets. So as a small business, someone clicks buy on your products, you don't know how much the tax bill will end up being in this cross-border space. It could be nothing. It could be in your entire profit and then some. So that is a major problem. And then how do you pay that VAT in a different market? You have to be registered in that different market with the tax authorities. You have to have a bank account that pays out in that local currency. You are required to pay that VAT at the moment that the sale is made. But you may not get paid for that sale for a long time because it can take forever for payments to go through. So you're responsible for paying something to the government, what you haven't been reimbursed yet. So for cash flow issues for small businesses, like what a nightmare. So there are lots of governments who want revenue. And there are lots of reasons why governments are worried about an uneven playing field between the digital e-commerce companies and the offline retailers. But I think the extra challenges for small businesses in this new and evolving space means that there's fewer opportunities than there used to be. So small businesses will be caught out and will end up with bigger bills than they imagined. And so, I mean, this is a real problem that we've been working hard with governments for them to understand some of these issues. So if my plea to those of you who are watching, If you are a small company and you are trying to sell cross-border or even buy from abroad, please let government, if you can, or let Sven know and he'll tell governments, let somebody know what the issues are for you, because otherwise governments don't understand, I think, some of the problems attached, especially to small business operations. So they assume that they make these rules and only big companies will have to pay them and they'll sort it out. But actually it hits your small business. And suddenly a very lucrative market that you thought was going to be key for you coming out of COVID is no longer lucrative. And in fact, you could go bankrupt because you can't even pay the tax bill attached to that market. So these are some real challenges for small businesses that are not addressed usually in these trade agreements like an RCEP, but that matter a lot. So if you could please tell government what your issues are, that would go a long ways towards fixing some of it, because I just think they just don't understand how it affects small businesses.
Sven, I have I want to make an input here. I think that Deborah made a very good point. But the good thing here is that in Cambodia, we're a small country. It's very open in the sense that the government, I mean, let's be real, most of the government never been in business. So, I mean, I agree with you, Debbie, that sometimes we sit in an office and we come up with rules that we read from books. Huh? I mean, that's a reality. But the good thing is that they are very pro-private sector. And in the case of Cambodia, there are so many chambers, the Young Entrepreneur Association, the Cambodian Women Entrepreneur Association, the Chamber, the Eurochamp, they are very active in terms of lobbying the government. I shouldn't use the word lobby. I think they're very active to explain to the government their concern. And the government on their side, they are also quite, I would say, receptive to hearing the concern. In particularly the last couple of years, with the COVID hitting, a lot of, say for example, the Cambodian Women Entrepreneur Association, they try to explain to them the reality facing women entrepreneur, facing small entrepreneur. They're working on a white paper, that sort of thing. And at some point, you know, the government will entertain, you know, their concerns. So this is something I concur with you, Debbie, that and also Nirad, I think we have to encourage our association to work together to come up with issue that affect small business. And in the case of Cambodia, 99% of Cambodian business are small and you know, enterprise. So they can come up with, well, of course, they cannot just come, well, I need some break, right? I mean, without some logical argument, that sort of thing. But if they come up with a good argument, just scientific base, evidence based, empirical base, you know, to show that certain rules, certain regulation will affect them and it will wipe them out, you know, I'm pretty sure the government will be receptive to change. Because in the case of Cambodia, I can tell you for the last nearly 30 years, we listen to the private sector. Most of the policy are driven by private sector. So that's something that I'm, on one side, I'm a bit worried that, you know, we have regulation that are coming out of the blue that sort of like shock the private sector. But on the other hand, a year later, if we get organized enough, we probably can get some of this regulation amended or removed. Yeah. Okay, Sven.
Thank you, Dr. Spana. I think you answered some of the questions that we have here posted by Mr. Faisal Al-Kaf, and they are very good questions on some of these issues that we're facing cross-border and different type of regulations and standards in different countries. We don't have the time to answer all the questions. I hope, Mr. Faisal, we have answered some of your questions here. It's almost 10, so I'd like to thank the three of you for your very candid views. And I knew, and I told Jeremy, let's have Deborah and let's have Dr. Sifana and Nilerat, because they will speak from experience. They will speak from hard-earned experience, I would say. So thank you for doing that. You've set the scene what's to come, I invite you to stay for session 2, which is purely on how the Cambodian private sector is getting ready or is very knowledgeable on RCEP and what they see as the potential and the challenges and obstacles for that. So thank you, Dr. Sipana, thank you, Deborah and Niredrat. And with this, I give the floor back to the mask Jeremy.